In the summer of 1914, a single gunshot in a quiet European city set off a chain reaction that would engulf the entire world. Within weeks, empires mobilized millions of soldiers, alliances turned neighbors into enemies, and industrial technology transformed battlefields into unimaginable killing grounds. World War I, later called the Great War, reshaped nations, destroyed empires, and left scars that still shape global politics today. From the assassination that ignited the conflict to the trenches, chemical weapons, collapsing empires, and the fragile peace that followed, this is the story of the first truly global war. Welcome to Midnight Chronicles, where the shadows meet the facts. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe stood at the peak of its imperial power, but beneath the surface tensions were building rapidly. Powerful empires dominated the continent, including the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and France. These nations competed fiercely for political influence, military strength, and colonial territory across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Industrialization had transformed economies and military capabilities, allowing countries to build massive armies equipped with modern weapons. At the same time, nationalism was spreading throughout Europe, encouraging ethnic groups and smaller nations to demand independence or greater political power. The Balkans region, located in southeastern Europe, became particularly unstable. Serbia, supported by Russia, promoted Slavic nationalism, while Austria-Hungary attempted to maintain control over territories with diverse ethnic populations. Diplomatic alliances formed as nations sought protection from potential rivals. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy created the Triple Alliance, while France, Russia, and Britain formed the Triple Entente. These alliances were intended to maintain balance, but they also meant that a conflict involving one nation could quickly escalate into a continental war. Military planning became increasingly aggressive, with countries preparing detailed mobilization strategies that required immediate action once triggered. Many political leaders believed that war, if it came, would be short and decisive. Few could imagine the scale of destruction that modern industrial warfare would soon unleash. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. The region had recently been annexed by Austria-Hungary, angering Serbian nationalists who believed Bosnia should become part of a larger Slavic state. A secret nationalist group known as the Black Hand supported radical young activists who wanted to strike against Austro-Hungarian authority. Among them was 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip. Earlier that day, several conspirators attempted to attack the Archduke's motorcade, but their efforts failed. Later in the afternoon, by coincidence, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn and stopped near a cafe where Princip happened to be standing. Seizing the unexpected opportunity, Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots at close range. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand, while the other fatally wounded his wife Sophie. Both died within minutes. News of the assassination shocked Europe. For Austria-Hungary, the killing represented not just an act of terrorism but a direct challenge to imperial authority. Leaders in Vienna believed Serbia had supported the attack and decided that decisive action was necessary. What followed was a diplomatic crisis that unfolded with alarming speed, drawing multiple powers toward war. Historians later referred to this period as the July Crisis, a series of political decisions that transformed a regional tragedy into the opening act of a global conflict. Following the assassination, Austria-Hungary sought to punish Serbia. However, the empire needed support from its powerful ally, Germany. German leaders assured Austria-Hungary that they would provide full backing, a commitment sometimes called the blank check. Encouraged by this support, Austria-Hungary issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia in July 1914. The demands included allowing Austrian officials to conduct investigations within Serbian territory, something that would have compromised Serbia's sovereignty. Serbia accepted most of the conditions but rejected several key points. Austria-Hungary considered the response insufficient and declared war on July 28, 1914. The alliance system quickly activated. Russia, which saw itself as the protector of Slavic nations like Serbia, began mobilizing its army. Germany responded by declaring war on Russia on August 1. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally. To execute its military strategy, Germany planned to defeat France quickly by invading through neutral Belgium. When German troops crossed the Belgian border, Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, citing its obligation to protect Belgian neutrality. Within a single week, most of Europe's major powers were at war. Mobilization orders sent millions of soldiers rushing toward borders and railway stations. What had begun as a political crisis now became a full-scale international conflict that would soon spread far beyond Europe. Germany's war plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to avoid fighting on two fronts simultaneously. German strategists believed Russia would mobilize slowly, giving Germany time to defeat France first. To accomplish this, German armies advanced through Belgium and Luxembourg, hoping to sweep around French defenses and capture Paris quickly. However, Belgium resisted fiercely despite being heavily outnumbered. The invasion shocked the world, particularly Britain, which had guaranteed Belgian neutrality through earlier treaties. Reports of civilian suffering during the invasion, including destroyed villages and executions, intensified international outrage. Meanwhile, French forces attempted to launch their own offensives along the border but suffered heavy losses. As German troops pushed toward Paris, the situation became desperate for the Allies. In September 1914, the First Battle of the Marne halted the German advance just outside the French capital. Both sides dug defensive positions that soon developed into massive trench systems. What many had expected to be a short war suddenly transformed into a long, brutal stalemate. Soldiers on both sides began constructing complex networks of trenches, barbed wire, and fortified bunkers stretching hundreds of kilometers across northern France and Belgium. These trenches would soon become the defining symbol of the Western Front and one of the most terrifying environments of modern warfare. By the winter of 1914, the Western Front had solidified into a vast system of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Soldiers lived in narrow muddy ditches often flooded with water and surrounded by barbed wire. Conditions were miserable and dangerous. Rats thrived in the trenches, feeding on food scraps and sometimes on the bodies of fallen soldiers. Lice spread rapidly among troops, causing constant itching and illness. The damp conditions led to trench foot, a painful condition where skin rotted from prolonged exposure to moisture. Artillery bombardments could strike at any moment, sending explosions that buried men alive or shattered defensive lines. Machine guns made crossing open ground almost impossible, turning attacks into deadly disasters. Despite these horrors, soldiers spent long periods waiting, listening for enemy movements and preparing for sudden assaults. Nighttime patrols ventured into no man's land, the barren territory between opposing trenches littered with craters and corpses. Psychological strain was immense. Many soldiers developed severe anxiety and trauma, later known as shell shock. Letters and diaries from the trenches describe exhaustion, fear, and the constant presence of death. For millions of soldiers, trench warfare became a daily struggle for survival in conditions that combined industrial technology with primitive living conditions, creating a battlefield environment unlike anything the world had seen before. While the Western Front settled into trench stalemate, the Eastern Front unfolded across vast territories stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Here the war moved more fluidly, with enormous armies maneuvering across forests, plains, and mountain ranges. Germany and Austria-Hungary faced the massive forces of the Russian Empire. In August 1914, Russian armies invaded East Prussia, hoping to quickly pressure Germany. However, German commanders Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff executed a brilliant counteroffensive at the Battle of Tannenberg. Russian forces were surrounded and destroyed, suffering catastrophic losses of soldiers captured or killed. Despite this victory, the Eastern Front remained unstable. Austria-Hungary struggled against Russian offensives in Galicia, while Russian troops pushed deep into Central European territory. The enormous distances created supply problems, leaving soldiers vulnerable to hunger, disease, and extreme weather. Winter campaigns proved particularly brutal, as poorly equipped troops fought in freezing conditions with inadequate shelter. Entire divisions suffered frostbite and illness. Unlike the static trenches in France, the Eastern Front witnessed massive troop movements, sudden collapses, and devastating encirclements. Civilians living in these regions endured occupation, forced evacuations, and destruction of farmland. Towns were repeatedly captured and abandoned, leaving populations trapped between advancing armies. Millions of refugees fled the violence, carrying stories of burning villages and desperate marches across frozen landscapes. The Eastern Front revealed the immense scale of World War I, where entire regions became battlefields and military strategy often determined the fate of civilian population. As the war expanded, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in late 1914, opening new fronts across the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman leadership hoped to regain lost influence and challenge Russian control in the Caucasus. Fighting soon erupted across multiple regions, including the deserts of Mesopotamia, the mountains of eastern Anatolia, and the Sinai Peninsula. British and Allied forces sought to weaken the Ottoman Empire by targeting strategic routes such as the Suez Canal, a critical supply line connecting Britain to its colonial territories. Campaigns in these harsh landscapes were shaped by extreme heat, limited water supplies, and long supply routes. Soldiers marched across deserts where dehydration and disease could be as deadly as enemy fire. Meanwhile, Arab nationalist movements began rising against Ottoman rule. The Arab Revolt, supported by British intelligence and military advisors such as T.E. Lawrence, sought to undermine Ottoman authority in the Arabian Peninsula. Guerrilla warfare disrupted Ottoman supply lines and railways, weakening their ability to defend distant territories. The Middle Eastern Front also witnessed large civilian suffering as famine and displacement spread through war-torn regions. Cities once connected by trade networks became isolated by military blockades and damaged infrastructure. The Ottoman participation widened the war's geographic scope dramatically, turning what began as a European conflict into a struggle stretching across 3 continents. One of the most ambitious Allied operations of the war took place in 1915 on the Gallipoli Peninsula in present-day Turkey. Allied leaders believed that capturing the Dardanelles Strait would open a direct sea route to Russia and potentially force the Ottoman Empire out of the war. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops launched an amphibious invasion against heavily defended Ottoman positions. However, the campaign quickly descended into a brutal stalemate. Ottoman forces, commanded by capable leaders including Mustafa Kemal, defended the rugged terrain with determination. Soldiers on both sides endured harsh conditions in narrow trenches overlooking steep cliffs and rocky beaches. Heat, flies, and disease plagued the troops, while water shortages made survival even more difficult. Attacks across exposed terrain often ended in devastating casualties. The campaign dragged on for months with little progress. Ultimately, the Allies decided to evacuate their forces in early 1916. Although the withdrawal was conducted successfully, Gallipoli became a powerful symbol of sacrifice and national identity, particularly for Australia and New Zealand. For the Ottoman Empire, the victory strengthened morale and solidified Mustafa Kemal's reputation as a military leader. Gallipoli demonstrated how strategic miscalculations and challenging geography could transform military plans into prolonged and deadly struggles. World War I introduced technologies that reshaped warfare forever. Machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute made frontal assaults extraordinarily deadly. Heavy artillery became the dominant weapon on the battlefield, capable of destroying trenches, buildings, and entire landscapes. Explosive shells turned fields into cratered wastelands filled with mud and debris. Chemical weapons also emerged during the conflict. In 1915, poison gas was used on a large scale during battles on the Western Front. Chlorine and later mustard gas caused agonizing injuries, blindness, and suffocation. Soldiers were issued primitive gas masks, but fear of gas attacks remained constant. Tanks were introduced by the British in 1916 as armored vehicles designed to cross trenches and barbed wire. Early models were slow and unreliable but signaled a new era of mechanized warfare. Aircraft also played an increasing role, initially for reconnaissance but later for aerial combat and bombing missions. Pilots engaged in dogfights above battlefields while observing enemy troop movements. Submarines, particularly German U-boats, threatened shipping lanes across the Atlantic. Merchant vessels carrying supplies became targets, drawing neutral nations closer to the conflict. The war's technological innovations dramatically increased the scale of destruction and transformed the nature of military strategy. Naval power played a crucial role in shaping the global dynamics of World War I. The British Royal Navy established a powerful blockade against Germany, restricting access to vital supplies including food, raw materials, and industrial resources. This blockade gradually weakened the German economy and contributed to widespread shortages among civilians. Germany responded by deploying submarine warfare to disrupt Allied shipping routes. German U-boats targeted merchant vessels carrying supplies to Britain and its allies. The sinking of ships sometimes resulted in heavy civilian casualties, especially when passenger vessels were caught in the conflict. One of the most famous incidents occurred in 1915 when the passenger liner RMS Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine, killing over 1,000 people, including American citizens. The attack increased international condemnation and intensified tensions between Germany and the United States. Meanwhile, major naval battles also took place, including the Battle of Jutland in 1916 between British and German fleets. Although tactically inconclusive, the battle reinforced Britain's naval dominance and continued blockade strategy. Naval warfare extended far beyond large battleships. Mines, submarines, and patrol vessels created dangerous waters across the North Sea and Atlantic Ocean. For sailors and merchant crews, the ocean itself became a battlefield where unseen threats could strike without warning. In February 1916, Germany launched a massive offensive against the French fortress region of Verdun, initiating one of the longest and most brutal battles of World War I. German commanders believed that attacking the symbolic location would force the French army into a defensive struggle that would slowly bleed it of manpower and resources. The strategy became known as a war of attrition. Massive artillery bombardments began the assault, turning forests and villages into shattered landscapes of craters and rubble. French soldiers were ordered to hold the line at all costs, and the phrase, "they shall not pass," became a rallying cry across the nation. For 10 months, waves of attacks and counterattacks raged across the battlefield. Soldiers rotated constantly through the front lines, many surviving only days under relentless shellfire. The environment itself became a weapon. Poison gas clouds drifted across trenches while shattered trees and collapsed bunkers buried men alive. Supplies had to be transported along a single road known as the Sacred Way, which remained constantly filled with trucks bringing reinforcements and ammunition. By the time the battle finally ended in December 1916, both sides had suffered staggering losses. More than 700,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in the struggle for control of a few devastated hills and forts. Verdun became a symbol of endurance and sacrifice, but it also revealed the horrifying reality of industrialized warfare, where entire armies could be consumed in prolonged battles with little strategic gain. While the battle at Verdun raged, Allied forces launched their own massive offensive along the Somme River in northern France during the summer of 1916. The goal was to relieve pressure on the French army and break through German defenses. On July 1st, the first day of the offensive, British troops advanced across open ground toward heavily fortified German positions. The soldiers believed that days of artillery bombardment had destroyed enemy defenses, but many German bunkers had survived. As the attacking troops moved forward, machine guns opened fire with devastating effect. Within hours, tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded. It remains one of the bloodiest days in British military history. The battle continued for months as both sides struggled to gain territory. Mud, rain, and constant shelling transformed the battlefield into a devastated wasteland. During this offensive, the British Army introduced a new weapon designed to break trench stalemates, the tank. Early tanks were slow and mechanically unreliable, but they demonstrated the potential of armored warfare. By the end of the campaign in November 1916, more than 1 million soldiers had been killed or wounded across both sides. The Somme became a tragic example of how military commanders struggled to adapt to modern technology, sending waves of infantry into conditions where survival was often measured in minutes. Although the main battles of World War I occurred in Europe, the conflict quickly spread to colonial territories across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. European empires drew heavily on their colonies for soldiers, laborers, and resources. African troops served in campaigns against German colonial forces in regions such as East Africa and Cameroon. These battles often took place in jungles, deserts, and remote landscapes where disease posed as much danger as combat. Thousands of African civilians were forced into labor to support military logistics, building roads and transporting supplies through difficult terrain. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan joined the Allied powers and seized German-controlled islands and territories in China. Meanwhile, Indian soldiers serving under British command fought on several fronts, including the Western Front in France and campaigns in the Middle East. Colonial troops often faced discrimination and were sometimes sent into particularly dangerous operations. Despite their contributions, many of these soldiers received little recognition after the war ended. The global reach of World War I demonstrated how imperial systems could transform a regional conflict into a worldwide struggle, affecting millions of people far beyond the borders of Europe. While soldiers fought on distant battlefields, civilians across Europe faced their own devastating hardships. The war disrupted agriculture, industry, and trade networks that many countries relied upon for food and supplies. Naval blockades limited access to imported goods, while farmland in combat zones was destroyed by artillery and troop movements. In Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, food shortages became severe. Malnutrition and starvation spread among civilian populations, especially during the harsh winter of 1916 to 1917. Cities experienced rationing, and long lines formed outside bakeries and markets. Families struggled to survive as governments prioritized military supplies over civilian needs. In occupied territories, civilians often endured forced labor, confiscation of property, and harsh military control. Refugee crises also emerged as millions fled advancing armies. Entire communities were uprooted, forced to travel long distances with limited resources. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded refugee camps and war-torn regions. For many civilians, the war brought constant fear and uncertainty. Air raids and artillery bombardments occasionally reached towns and cities, reminding civilians that modern warfare no longer remained confined to distant battlefields. One of the most devastating consequences of World War I was the psychological trauma experienced by soldiers exposed to prolonged combat. The constant threat of death, the thunder of artillery explosions, and the sight of wounded comrades created intense mental strain. Many soldiers developed a condition known at the time as shell shock. Symptoms included trembling, nightmares, paralysis, memory loss, and uncontrollable anxiety. Early in the war, military authorities often misunderstood these symptoms, believing they were signs of cowardice or weakness. Some soldiers suffering from psychological trauma were punished or forced back into combat despite their condition. Over time, doctors began to recognize that the relentless stress of trench warfare could break even the strongest individuals. Hospitals and medical units attempted various treatments, though understanding of psychological injuries remained limited. Letters and diaries written by soldiers reveal their struggle to maintain hope while facing unimaginable horror. The psychological wounds of the war did not end when the fighting stopped. Many veterans returned home with lasting trauma that affected their lives for decades. World War I forced societies to confront the hidden costs of modern warfare, where the battlefield could leave invisible scars that were just as devastating as physical injuries. By 1917, the Russian Empire was nearing total collapse under the enormous strain of war. Years of military defeats, massive casualties, food shortages, and economic instability had pushed the country to the brink. Soldiers at the front were poorly supplied, often lacking ammunition, food, and even proper winter clothing. Meanwhile, civilians in major cities like Petrograd faced severe shortages of bread and fuel. Protests and strikes erupted as public frustration with the government intensified. In March 1917, widespread demonstrations forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate the throne, ending centuries of imperial rule. A temporary government attempted to continue the war alongside the Allied powers, but the army was already disintegrating. Discipline collapsed as soldiers deserted in massive numbers, refusing to continue fighting in a war that had brought them nothing but suffering. Later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power during the October Revolution. Determined to remove Russia from the conflict, the new government negotiated peace with Germany. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, officially ending Russia's participation in World War I. The treaty forced Russia to surrender vast territories, but for Germany it meant something crucial. Millions of troops could now be moved from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. This shift dramatically changed the strategic balance of the war and set the stage for Germany's final attempt to win the conflict before new enemies could intervene. While Europe had been locked in brutal conflict for years, the United States initially attempted to remain neutral. However, several events gradually pushed the country toward involvement in the war. German submarine warfare played a major role in escalating tensions. German U-boats targeted ships crossing the Atlantic, including vessels carrying American passengers and supplies. The sinking of passenger ships and merchant vessels outraged public opinion in the United States. Another major turning point came with the interception of the Zimmermann telegram in 1917. In this secret message, Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States if America entered the war. When the message became public, it shocked American citizens and intensified support for joining the conflict. In April 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. Although American troops required time to train and mobilize, their arrival significantly strengthened the Allied position. Fresh soldiers, industrial resources, and financial support gave the Allies renewed momentum. American forces eventually played an important role in major offensives during the final year of the war. Their entry into the conflict shifted the balance of power and signaled that Germany now faced a growing coalition with greater resources and manpower. In early 1918, German military leaders recognized that time was running out. With American forces preparing to arrive in large numbers, Germany launched a massive offensive on the Western Front in an attempt to break Allied lines before the balance of power shifted permanently. This series of attacks, known as the Spring Offensive, began in March 1918. German forces used new infiltration tactics, sending specially trained stormtroopers to bypass strong points and disrupt enemy positions from behind. Initially, the offensive achieved dramatic success. German troops advanced farther than at any point since the early days of the war, pushing Allied forces back across large areas of northern France. However, these gains came at a tremendous cost. German supply lines struggled to keep pace with the rapidly advancing troops, and exhausted soldiers found themselves stretched thin across captured territory. Meanwhile, Allied forces began reorganizing under unified command. Reinforcements from the United States continued arriving in Europe, strengthening the defensive lines. By mid-1918, the German advance began to slow and eventually stalled. What had been Germany's final opportunity to win the war was now turning into the beginning of its defeat. As the war continued into late 1918, the Central Powers began collapsing one by one. Bulgaria was the first to surrender in September after Allied forces broke through its defensive lines in the Balkans. Soon after, the Ottoman Empire also sought peace following defeats in the Middle East and the loss of key territories. Austria-Hungary, weakened by years of war and growing nationalist movements within its diverse population, soon followed. The once powerful empire was falling apart internally as various ethnic groups declared independence. Germany itself faced growing unrest. Food shortages, economic hardship, and military defeat caused widespread protests and strikes across the country. The German Navy experienced mutinies as sailors refused to launch what they believed would be a suicidal final battle. Facing political revolution and military collapse, the German government realized the war could no longer continue. In November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled the country. A new government was formed that immediately sought an armistice with the Allied powers. After more than 4 years of relentless warfare, the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918. Representatives of Germany and the Allied powers met inside a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France to negotiate an armistice agreement. The terms required Germany to withdraw its forces from occupied territories, surrender large quantities of military equipment, and accept Allied occupation of certain regions. At exactly 11 a.m., the ceasefire officially took effect. Along the Western Front, soldiers who had endured years of trench warfare cautiously emerged from their positions. Many could hardly believe the fighting had finally ended. Across Europe, crowds gathered in streets and public squares to celebrate the end of the conflict. Yet behind the celebrations lay the staggering human cost of the war. More than 16 million people had lost their lives, including soldiers and civilians. Entire towns had been destroyed, landscapes had been permanently scarred, and millions of families mourned loved ones who would never return. Although the fighting had stopped, the political consequences of the war were only beginning. In 1919, leaders from the victorious Allied nations gathered in Paris to negotiate a formal peace treaty with Germany. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. The agreement imposed severe penalties on Germany, including territorial losses, military restrictions, and massive financial reparations. Germany was also forced to accept responsibility for causing the war, a clause that created deep resentment among its population. Several new nations were formed from the ruins of collapsed empires, including Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Borders were redrawn across Europe and the Middle East, often without fully considering the ethnic and political tensions within those regions. While the treaty aimed to prevent another global conflict, many historians believe its harsh terms instead planted the seeds for future instability. World War I transformed the world in ways that would shape the entire 20th century. For major empires, the German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires collapsed during or shortly after the war. Millions of soldiers returned home physically wounded or psychologically scarred by their experiences. Entire generations had grown up surrounded by the trauma of industrial warfare. Economies across Europe struggled to recover from years of destruction and financial strain. The war also reshaped international politics. New alliances and institutions were formed in an attempt to maintain global peace, including the creation of the League of Nations. However, unresolved political tensions and economic hardship continued to simmer beneath the surface. Many historians now view World War I not as an isolated conflict but as the beginning of a turbulent era that would eventually lead to even greater global upheaval. The war that began in 1914 with the assassination of a single archduke had ultimately reshaped the political map of the world and altered the course of human history forever. For years of destruction, millions of lives lost, empires collapsed, borders redrawn, and the world permanently changed. The First World War ended in 1918, but its consequences would echo for decades, eventually leading to another global conflict even more devastating. History remembers it as the Great War, a reminder of how fragile peace can truly be. This was Midnight Chronicles, where the shadows meet the facts. If you want more real stories from history's darkest chapters, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for the next episode.